using AI to write code, it works to the degree that I have a systems level understanding of what I want the code to do and how I want it to work.
If I had to bet on one thing that was not going to change with AI, it's that enterprises will still have silos.
Yeah, and a lot of enterprises are out there doing M&A, and it's part of their strategy to go acquire another business unit. If you just think about what it means to arm every developer with a Copilot or Codex or an autonomous agent that it can supervise, right? We're going to get a bunch of microservices. We're going to get a bunch of new consumers of APIs. There's a giant integration problem because of that.
Welcome back to Turn Stories. I'm your host, TR Jordan, and today I have an amazing guest, Matt DeBurglas, the CEO of Apollos. Matt, welcome to the show.
Thanks for having me. It's great to be here.
Awesome. So, Matt, you and I go way back. We first met 20 years ago in the basement of what was my dorm at college at the time. And I've been following your journey. That I've seen you build Act Blue and go to Meteor, and then Apollo, which is 9 years in at this point.
Yeah, 10 in a month.
Awesome. So here's what's interesting to me. Apollo came out of the problems that you saw at Meteor around APIs. And you've been working on this problem sort of across those two companies since 2012 or so. And you recently moved from the CTO seat to the CEO seat, which is really says to me that you're doubling down on this problem, and it's a big commitment. Tell me a little bit about what you're seeing at this stage that makes this problem continue to be worthwhile to work on 13 years in.
Oh gosh, there's so much there. Well, a lot of it goes back to school for me because we were both at MIT, and that's where I really fell in love with open source and platforms and a certain kind of engineering ethos, and that's carried me forward through all of this. Apollo is a API platform, and we build it because we think it helps lots of people build great software, and that's what gets me out of bed. That's why we do this. We just want to see a world where there's better tools, better experiences. I want that in my day-to-day life. I want my friends to be able to make better stuff. It's just so important to me. And the software that we use is more and more influential. I spent time in politics. So much of politics has gone online now, and it's become as much about the technology and the software experience as anything. And that's true in anything, art, science, commerce. So I think it's really important. I think it's worth doing. And I think the other piece of it for us is about if you look at it from a systems point of view, there's opportunities all across the stack to learn from maybe the patterns that we've used over the years and bake those into things that are reusable and battle tested. And we've seen this rise of platforms, in cloud native with Kubernetes. React is a good example on the UI, and it's been interesting. We're in the API space at Apollo. There aren't as many platforms there, and we think there's, when you think about APIs, they last a long time. APIs sit around for decades and decades, and just by their nature, because they're a rendezvous point between software systems, they're really hard to change. So you've got this interesting puzzle in the API world where companies have many of them. They're going to be around for a long time, and they are just by their nature fairly stable. And the question is, how do you adapt to a changing world around that? Like whether we're talking about AI today or we're talking about the rise of mobile a decade ago, there are these big forces in the world where companies have to be able to move fast and adapt and change. And the API tier is one of the things that I think has held people back, and we've been excited to make a big dent in that problem with what we do at Apollo.
That makes a lot of sense. I thought it was such an interesting decision to say, there's the compute layer, there's the API layer, there's front end, all of these things need to work well together if you're going to build an awesome system. But a lot of that, I was trying to think of other sort of competitors to GraphQL, it's not like REST is a single framework or a single spec. And all of the other things underneath and around it, gRPC or, Thrift, RIP, um, are more, transporty
Yeah, that's right.
than something that really like focuses on developer ergonomics.
A lot of people see GraphQL as another kind of API. So you can put it next to REST or next to gRPC. And I mean, that's technically accurate, but it's really more a query language that you can use with the APIs that you have. The idea of GraphQL really is I ought to be able to query my REST APIs, if that makes sense. Like, I shouldn't be limited to exactly one API call at a time and getting back exactly all of the data from that API. That's a really limited way to think about an API. The big idea with GraphQL is it's like a database. I might want a little bit out of this table and a little bit out of that table, and I want to join them together, and I want to make some transformation to what comes back. That's what makes databases so powerful. GraphQL gives us a language to do that with APIs. Because if you think about any piece of software, like think about an e-commerce application, the stuff you're looking at on the screen came from a ton of different APIs, and it's got to all be tied together in a very particular way. And every year or two, some new platform comes along. Like maybe you have to build something for IoT or now for the new AI platforms. Each of those means you have to go sort of rethink those combinations, rethink the way you want to use your APIs. And the query language just makes that so much faster, so much better than handwriting a bunch of code to do it. That's where the benefit of it comes from. It's the same idea as like Kubernetes. We used to write code to deploy our software onto machines. We don't do that anymore, right? There's a piece of infrastructure that does that for you. You just tell it what you want. GraphQL is like that for your API calls.
Yeah. And that makes a ton of sense. I'm curious what you're seeing there around AI in particular. There is, I think, a lot of information out there, especially, the Apollo customer list is pretty impressive. A lot of large companies on there. Um, are you seeing a different sort of pull from them around how they're using and thinking about APIs with AI in the mix?
Yeah, there's actually three. AI is such a big change, and I see it show up three different ways at our customers. Um, One is you've got everybody's moving to agentic development,
Mm-hmm.
and we're learning how you do that well. We are learning that when you ask an agent to write code for you, the more that code can sit on top of strong abstractions, the better it writes. Like it's better to write concise code if you can use fewer tokens instead of more tokens. The LLMs get much better, and people are learning about code quality and all the techniques that drive that. So just when we think about if your options are writing a bunch of procedural code to call APIs in a certain order, but the alternative is just writing a 3-line or 5-line GraphQL query, you get better results with the query. And we've seen a lot of benefit as people move to that. Then you've got so AI makes software really cheap to write because the engineers get so much more productive,
Mm-hmm.
and it works better in smaller code bases. And so we're all about to be the proud owners of a lot of microservices. If you just think about what it means to arm every developer with, a Copilot or Codex or an autonomous agent that it can supervise, right? We're going to get a bunch of microservices. We're going to get a bunch of new consumers of APIs, and there's a giant integration problem because of that. Because every company is suddenly going to have to tie all that new stuff together with all the old stuff, and that's an API problem, right? And the whatever strategy you had for integration probably isn't ready for a 10x jump in the amount of integration code you have to write. If you just think about where things break and how this is all going to scale. And GraphQL, goes right at this problem is our view, right? You if you can do that integration work by just writing declarative descriptions of what those services offer and declarative queries of how you want to combine them together, that's a lot better than writing thousands and thousands and thousands of lines of bespoke integration code for each new combination. And then the third thing they run into is everybody wants to ship agentic apps. And this is where things get really interesting because, to me, the story of app development over the last 10, 20 years has been apps get adopted when they meet the user where the user wants to be met. And I think people are realizing just how much better the application experience is if you can put a little bit of agentic or freeform or personalized attributes to it. And the thing about these AI apps is they just, for APIs, it's totally different. They use MCP instead of REST, and they are inherently more freeform. So the world of I wrote an API and it has a very specific shape and it does a very specific thing, that worked pretty well for the old style of apps where you've got a certain set of screens that were carefully designed by people. But in a world where the app changes every minute or every session or between two different users, doesn't seem like that model is really going to work. We're going to need a different way of thinking about what an API even is and how you think about them. You're going to have a lot more of them. They're going to have a much faster pace of change. Just all kinds of interesting implications come up. And that puts a ton of pressure on any sort of traditional API strategy or stack that people are building around.
Yeah, that makes sense. So here's a thing that I thought a lot about this probably about 12 months ago, and I still think a lot about this, is if you think about like all the things that are going to change, if I had to bet on one thing that was not going to change with AI, it's that enterprises will still have silos. And
Yeah,
it's
I
hard to
agree.
imagine a world without that. How I think it makes a lot of sense, like in theory, to add like more connectivity and to push the power of the tooling such that you can integrate more data together. Like I absolutely agree. We're all going to own 10, 100 times as much code. But how do you think about the idea of like it feels like a paradox to me that enterprises are just never going to be flat on any dimension. They're not going to be flat with their organization. They're not going to be flat with their P&L, and they're not going to be flat with their data access. So how does that tension like run into using something like a GraphQL or even just like influencing the API strategy overall?
Yeah, and a lot of enterprises are out there doing M&A, and it's part of their
Yeah.
strategy to go acquire another business unit. And just by definition, none of that stuff has been built in a coordinated way. But probably the goal of the acquisition was to tie it all together somehow. I'll give you an example. We do a lot of work in the hospitality space, and uh, if you go to a conference for hotel operators, one of the big topics is moving to a model where you want to think about not just renting hotel rooms for the night. You have a certain price for those, but a model that's more about the total revenue per guest. And it's just a fancy way of saying like you also want to offer that guest a restaurant reservation. You want to get them, a spa appointment. You want to sell them maybe for an extra fee, the ability to check in early. And it's interesting because some of this is coming. It's not just coming from the CFO that wants margins. There are travelers that want to know they can check into their hotel room early,
Mm-hmm.
and they'll pay
Yeah.
for that, and they will pick the hotel that offers them that. So there's this urgency to create this new kind of checkout experience, like reservation experience online that gives you this stuff. And if you go look inside the hotel, what you find is the room reservation system goes back to the Mesozoic era. It was never built for the web, right?
Yeah.
It's the thing that the person at the desk is using when you show up to the desk to like assign a room. And so you have to adapt that system. It isn't going anywhere. They're not going to rip that out, but you have to adapt it to this whole new kind of customer experience that they're looking for. So you can call it a silo. I just think it's the world we live in. It's a consequence of building a large company that's durable. The world's going to change around it, and you're going to accumulate all of these systems and capabilities. Like the ability to assign hotel rooms is sort of a core business capability of any hotel. And it's to the degree that they can wire that into these apps that they want to build, or um, partner experiences, because a lot of this stuff gets booked through credit cards now, or other travel partners. Like, you just think about the modern way that people go make these travel plans. That's the heart of, I think, every large company's challenge. And I just think the companies that are best at putting those things together in new ways are the ones that keep winning. They're the
Yeah.
ones that, just feel modern, and they meet the customer the way they want to be met. And
Mhm.
there's a big advantage to that.
Yeah, I buy that. And there's a certain amount of like, you don't need like those silos to the extent they exist will continue to exist. You don't need all of the data out of any particular silo. You just need the ability to book a room. How it gets done, it's like that's all behind. Yeah.
Yeah. And I think it just, in practice, it's a lot faster to do what you just said, and make use of that capability in a new way than it is to go rethink the core idea of a room reservation and all of the systems and technology and everything that's baked into that, right? Like, um, or, media is another example. Media's changed so much. It was a content business, and it was fueled by advertising. There was a certain business model for a newspaper, or any, content publisher, but media is so different now. It's really a subscription uh, model for a lot of companies. It's also about M&A. And if you think about a property like New York Times, they've got product reviews with Wirecutter, they've got cooking, they've got The Athletic. Like that's a media experience in 2025. And it would be a mistake to think about rebuilding all of those things to eliminate the silo. That's not the point at all. The point is, you want to, as a company, be really good at having separate capabilities. It's how you scale. It's how you grow.
Mhm.
So I just think about it in terms of, those things are your Lego bricks, and the people that are fastest at making cool Lego kits are going to have the models that are what people want.
Yeah. Yeah. That makes a lot of sense. Do you do you think that the world do you how much of this knowledge, like there's this implicit like um I was gonna say model, but model means a very specific like thing right now. It means an LLM. But there's a mental model. There's
Yeah.
a like a schema of what you want baked into any given API, or more precisely the usage of any given API. And it feels like there's both there's like a chicken and egg problem here of you need to understand what is happening in you need to understand what exists out there, which for ancient systems is like really challenging to understand. Um, and you have to go look at the usage of those things in order to understand both what a system is capable of, and what is valuable about a system. And I think what I'm having trouble squaring is, like you said, that APIs live forever, and like even new APIs live for quite a long time. How do you think about the kind of like accumulated cruft, not just of like the code that does stuff, but of the APIs and the ways to do things, and especially how that interacts with like what is the right way to do things? Like it feels like building endless APIs on top of internal systems in order to build new capabilities is just another like several layers of stuff to do archaeology through as we look 5 or 10 years out.
I'll give you an example. Tell me if I'm on the right track here. Uh, in a traditional API, like a REST API, you get back a pile of stuff, like a JSON response, right? and it might be really big. You could have 100, maybe 1,000 different, properties or attributes, pieces of data inside that response. And the whole thing at some level is opaque. Like you call the API, you get back the stuff. And the whole idea of an API is there's this abstraction layer, this boundary. So the provider of the stuff has no idea and does not care how the stuff's being used. That's like the idea of an abstraction. GraphQL plays with that a little bit, because with GraphQL, you write a query and you get really fine grained. You say, I want this property, this property, this property, and this property, right? And I kind of want to shape them this way. So one of the things we've learned is that if you own a microservice with an API, if people are calling that through a REST or a thrift or a traditional API interface, you don't really know what they're doing with that.
Oh,
You
that's
don't
cool. Yeah.
know you don't know which fields are actually being used and which ones got dropped on the floor. You don't have any real way to know where to focus maybe your optimization work. You're flying blind. Like you just have no idea. But with something like GraphQL, you do. You can see they only wanted these parts. They wanted, you can also see they went off and called this other API next to get these other parts. There's all kinds of valuable for a technology, person who owns one of these APIs. There's all kinds of valuable operational, diagnostic, performance data that lives there. If you're a business person, there's business intelligence to understand how your customers are interacting with your capabilities
Hmm.
that's always been hidden before. Is that what you're getting at? Like
Yeah,
I'm
absolutely. I think
we
that's a perfect insight is that you actually know what people are consuming because they have asked for it and they don't have to ask for the whole thing.
Yeah, it's an explicit sort of intent model instead of a procedural approach where I just follow the instructions and I don't know why. And this turns out to be a delightfully good fit with AI because when we think about what it means for LLMs to talk to APIs and that's what an agent is, right? It's just a model that can do stuff. The models are really good at describing intent.
Hmm.
That's a fancy way of just saying a query, right? Like they're really good at saying I want the following thing, and that I think turns out to be a good architecture to separate the non-deterministic part of the equation where the model can be creative and play around with whatever's going on in there, and then there's a deterministic part that says, okay, you want this, I'm going to go do it in a a way that like we can observe and understand and put some controls around, and that's the job of the API tier.
Yeah. Yeah, that makes a ton of sense that you really see sort of like the right way to use this is that you declare your intent. I need these things. I am going to use them for this purpose. AI or not, like that's the right way to use GraphQL and that's the right way to interact with an API.
And I don't know, we're really early in all of this, so um, take all of it with a grain of salt. It's just what I think, but it stands to reason. Here's another way of looking at it. Everyone I talk to is really between a rock and a hard place. They have some kind of a mandate to build AI first experiences.
Hmm.
Makes sense. On the other hand, I don't know if you've been following, but like the MCP security track record is pretty bad, right? Like I think the batting average is maybe 1 in 3 of these MCP services that get announced that don't have some gaping security hole that comes up a week later.
Hmm.
And it's just a tough place to be for anybody because you've got to move fast. You have a mandate all the way from the top of the company to do this, but all the usual rules and requirements still apply. Like you have to run a responsible business. There's all kinds of stuff you have to get right. And I think one thing we've learned over and again is that good platforms are part of the way you square the circle there. Like
Hmm.
it lets you build fast, but on top of some principled stuff, it lets you build in a world where a lot of the underlying technology may change. Like MCP itself is really new. It's
Hmm.
it's still changing every month. And
Yeah.
I don't know, there's it just goes to the idea you were getting at around how you tie these things together and what that looks like.
Yeah, absolutely. I want to pick at this a little bit because um, MCPs, the security notion within MCPs, a lot of the conversation these days is around the lethal trifecta. If an MCP has access to private data, the ability to communicate externally, and exposure to untrusted content, it's very easy for somebody, an attacker, to get that agent to do something that the user didn't want it to do. Um, it seems like GraphQL would make this problem worse because it's so flexible. How do you see that evolving, especially as we try to give more power to the tools and let especially these sort of enterprises move faster when they do have these individual silos?
Well, what GraphQL gives you is a declarative language that explains what's going on. I guess the way I would say it is GraphQL lets us analyze all of this stuff at build time instead of runtime.
Mm-hmm.
So the model, if you imagine you've got a big pile of APIs, let me take a step back and just the way we use GraphQL at Apollo is you've got a bunch of underlying APIs. Those are the REST APIs that you've had for a long time. You use Apollo to define, we call it a schema. It's basically just a catalog of what's in those APIs and how those objects connect to each other. That's your graph. And then you write a query, which says, I want this, this, and this out of the graph in this order. And so Apollo, if you want an MCP tool, you define that MCP tool as a query. You say, here's the tool, here's what I want it to return to the agent. And it's defined not as code that you run when the tool's called, but as a query that gets executed. So the cool thing about that approach, you're right, it's very flexible. That's what makes it so much faster to build an MCP tool this way. It's just like SQL is flexible. It's faster than writing a bunch of handwritten B trees, right?
Mm-hmm.
But the security story is good because I can look at a query at the time it's defined, and I can reason about what data is it accessing? Is any of that data marked as personal information? I can write rules that say certain things can only be used in certain combinations. And we get all kinds of this stuff. Like in we have a bunch of finance customers, and there's like legal requirements. This is downstream of an actual law in certain countries that says customer service reps can only look at a end user's billing record if there's an open support ticket from that user. Like you just
Sure.
legally can't have a human support person looking at somebody's like financial transactions. How do you implement rules like that has been a big challenge for, companies over the years. And now we want to have an agentic version of that, something where it's a LLM that's poking around your transaction records. And it starts to get pretty complicated. And the more we look at that, the more we see a, a solid sort of declarative model, I think is really the only way through, because the alternative where you're just going to have piles and piles and piles of what code you wrote in your favorite Python MCP framework this week that like does what exactly, it's just so hard to build that way if you're trying to go fast and if you don't know which of those projects you're going to want to take to production and which ones won't make sense, and when there's so much at stake from a security point of view.
That makes sense. How much do you see the I got to imagine that there's like the best customers in terms of like best practices and adopting, not just like the security of or this like security first approach to writing GraphQL, but just broadly making more data available. Like, what do you see as the most productive customers when they're trying to adopt a new technology at the API layer? And conversely, where do you see people making mistakes and not getting the adoption they want?
With MCP.
I was thinking with GraphQL,
Oh,
but if you've got information on MCP,
um,
like what, 3 minutes old?
there's a lot more of it happening than I think people realize. One thing I've noticed with MCP or with agents in general is that the companies that have gone furthest with this stuff and are finding value are finding a lot of value, and
Really?
they don't always want to talk about it.
I
It's a
certainly
huge
don't hear about it.
it's a huge competitive advantage.
Interesting.
AI is interesting because it's coming fast. Like if we think about some of these big technology trends, really big stuff like cloud took its time. If you really think about like how many years was that? And Amazon, I think to this day, is still very fond of starting their earnings reports with what a small fraction of the total enterprise spend is on cloud, right? Like
Mhm.
like it's just it's a gradual rollout. I don't know. This AI thing could just happen in a couple years. It's crazy.
Interesting.
And so if you're in a vertical and you've got some kind of an agentic experience that's better than your competitors, you may not want anybody to know that initially, right? You certainly don't want them to know how they're doing it. I don't know what my point was. How are people doing this?
Yeah, what are those companies doing better than others? Like,
Well, I think with, one model that emerged pretty early for agents is support, like customer support. And you can look at it as a margin improvement because agents are all in cheaper than the human support people that you would have used before. But I think the bigger story is it's what customers prefer. Like you can use the agent 24 hours a day. It speaks whatever language you speak. Like there's all these, and we're getting all kinds of examples that are published now around better support quality. So that's a model that's I think got legs, and it really boils down to how much of your how much of your footprint can you wire up to that agent, because the
mhm.
agent's not very good if it helps you for a second and says, oh, I can't actually do that part. Like
Right.
that's the worst agent experience, right? Like let me talk to your supervisor, and you're pounding on like the zero key over and over again. um and it's at least what we hear, because we're coming at this from the API side, is people just tell us like, look, my priority is to get as much of my API footprint agent ready as I can. I don't quite know what I want to do with it yet, but I know that an API that I have today, like a system or a capability that I have today that can't be used by an agent, is probably not that valuable. And I think sometimes you really need a really clear use case to know how to move forward, but sometimes there are sensible sort of first principles or foundation things that you can get a jump on that make a ton of sense. And I think we're in one of those moments because there's just so many open questions about AI. Like I think everybody reasonably looks at their phone and they count the icons on your home screen and you think, how many of these are still going to be with me? Like AI is going to change these a lot probably. And so it's so hard to predict. At least I don't feel like I can say what AI really means for the apps of the future or the, agentic experiences that you might want. I can imagine some things, but who knows? But what I do think we can say is that there are certain things in terms of how you're going to go build them or what the stack is going to look like that you're going to need in place and that we can start to get a clearer view of. And those are just timey or timeless things that, don't change like we were talking about before. So we try to come at it from that point of view. And it's a long way of saying the ones that have approached this the best way, I think, are taking a principled sort of platform view of it because they know that they're going to have to be really quick and agile. And the best way to do that is to start on some terra firma that you can trust.
Yeah. I think that makes a lot of sense. I remember I was an AI skeptic for a little while, which in retrospect, huge mistake. Totally wrong on that one. My bad. But my first theory was like, if we get this right, I could just talk to a company. Like I can talk to Walmart in a way that is not possible today. And like we're starting to get there in bits and pieces. And it turns out that Walmart doesn't actually want me to talk to it as a company with like full autonomy, but I understand that. Um, I think there is an interesting, uh, I think there is an interesting growth path here, though, where yeah, the best companies are exposing as much of the company as possible through like user friendly AI driven areas. One of the things that I hear a lot, because I talk to a lot of people about like let's modernize your software and let's upgrade it. And frankly, where we're focused right now tends to be people who own their software and like understand it. And they want to do React upgrades or whatever. And those that's a well trodden bit of the world. But there's this whole other part of the world which is like um, COBOL and mainframes and the transaction processing cores of the financial services. Those seem like some of the most valuable things to expose, but you literally don't have teams that like know how they work anymore. So even if you have a platform team that takes a principled approach, starts on that terra firma, what do they do if nobody knows how the system works?
Well, we actually have a lot of customers that have graph on top of mainframes,
Yeah.
and the story here is, I mean, it's, quick side note: my first internship when I was in school for a summer, I guess it was 1999, and I went to a startup that was uh, decompiling IBM mainframe software because they didn't have the original source code in COBOL and patching it for Y2K compliance. Like, so we'd add a bunch of like little trampolines and it would jump to this little bit of code that we inserted into the. Anyway, I'd forgot about that.
I love
Uh,
it.
I was a compiler kid growing up. I I love that stuff. Yeah, so the it's exactly what you said. They've got a mainframe. It's running business transactions. It's not going anywhere. And the obviously it was all designed long before we had the web, and I mean it was designed before we had ASCII. Like it's this stuff's old.
Yeah.
And the point is you got to adapt. You got to build some sort of a translation layer or an adaptation layer so that you can use it in the modern world. And so I see this pattern a lot. We see it with legacy databases too. There's a ton of stuff out there that's on old Oracle stuff, and they want to move to a modern database, and it's really hard to do that if you don't first create some sort of new abstraction that sits between the legacy database and the rest of the software that talks to it. Once you've got the abstraction in place, now you can go over to just the database and you can make whatever big migration you want from Oracle to Postgres or Oracle to MongoDB, and you're not wrestling with 100 different users of the database all at the same time.
Hmm.
So there's this pattern. It's sort of like a strangle pattern or abstraction pattern that lets you do that. I think with mainframes, it's just I don't see as much of the appetite for retiring them. I mean, I just think it's not my area of expertise, but if you're running financial transactions or ticketing systems, uh, for an airline or in a company like that, that mainframe is an asset, and there's 50 years of business logic that have been baked into that, and it's valuable. I think is the short way of saying it. And so the question is just how do I use it in more places, and how do I make it web ready or AI ready?
Hmm. Yeah, absolutely. I think that feels like the right approach for so many of these things. I think there's always appetite for getting rid of stuff that feels old or crufty, but it is so valuable. So, you know, what are you willing to pay to make that change? Like, sure, if it's free and snap your fingers, go do it. Um, but you got to look at the actual cost of both moving and the actual cost of keeping it around. And most of the time, the calculus says like, well, you know, put a layer around it and just keep using it.
Yeah, I mean, I think the other thing is with as with many things in the world, interest rates matter. And one thing I've seen is the appetite for big bang rewrites um, re-architectures, transformations really waned as interest rates went from very low to where they are now. And in 2020, when capital's cheap, when you're happy to have a 5-year return on your investment, and when you're really trying your best to hold on to your technical talent and give them interesting, technical problems, there's a lot more of this. And you saw it all across the stack in all kinds of places. In 2025, where the talent market's different, where capital is more expensive, where the street wants to see a better, earnings per share number, it's just different. And that lends itself, I think, much more toward what can we get done this quarter? How can we make incremental progress where we're reaping the benefits of our work, immediately? That's the mindset I keep finding. And it just leads to a different kind of transformation, a different way of approaching this kind of stuff.
Yeah. There's a question that's on the back of a lot of people's minds. If we've got a world where the infrastructure is more flexible, better Legos, allows for more combinations of what exists already, AI is great at writing glue code between all those things. What is a developer's role in the next 5 years?
Well, I think everybody's starting to see, well, I'll say my own experience using AI to write code. Um, I have found it. I mean, I'm the architect, I'm the tech lead, call it what you want, right? But in particular, what I keep finding is that it works to the degree that I have a sort of systems level understanding of what I want the code to do and how I want it to work. And maybe that's just me, and I've got a systems background, so that's how I think about writing software. But I just find if I can be very prescriptive about the where state lives in different parts of the app, or what the API interface or maybe the database schema looks like, and I'll get very in the weeds on that with the AI. The rest of the code between those interface layers, I don't have to worry about so much. Like I don't need to know as much about the you know the TSX code that's like drawing the screen, as long as I understand sort of the data model underneath it. So I think you know models will get better at that level of reasoning. I don't know how quickly. I don't think anybody does. Um, and yet I think that same idea of you can't really operate at one layer of the stack unless you understand the abstractions below it is still going to hold true. And I just think as AI gets better, the developer moves up and up and up in the stack. Um, the world needs a lot of software, is the thing. I don't see any desire to. I haven't met a company that doesn't have a backlog of software they really want to write. You know,
Yep.
so I think we're a long way from any sort of more fundamental change in, uh, not having people that are responsible for software development. I don't know. Maybe play this out far future, and the AIs run the roadmap, and they figure out all the software, and they write everything. But that's not today.
No, I don't think it's 5 years away either. I agree with you. I've had the same experience of if you're clear about where is the data and what should it look like to operate this system. Like there is an engineering way of thinking about systems that you're not going to get from a requirements doc,
You have to
and
know
how
what
it
you
gets.
want.
You got to decide.
Yeah, you have to know what you want. I don't think AI is all that close to knowing what you want. Like it's
No.
not magic. It's just a predictive, you know, next token thing. And so there's a lot still for the savvy developer. Actually, I mean, what I find is it really rewards that kind of skill set in developers, right? It's a powerful tool in the hands of a developer that sees it that way. At least that's the way we're trying to use it um, at Apollo, and that's been my experience.
Hmm. Makes sense. Um, we could talk all day. Let me move into a couple of quick fire questions. Um, and then we'll wrap up. The okay, I believe that every startup on some level is always a bet. You're you're trying a theory, and if it works, it's going to be great, and if it doesn't, you're going to have to come up with another bet. What is the bet that Apollo is making over the next 3 to 5 years?
The bet is that AI, and I walk through the three things it's doing, right? We're going to move to a different way of writing code. We're going to have a giant integration problem, and we're going to have a new kind of application experience or new user experience. AI, for all three of those reasons, really raises fundamental questions about what APIs are and how they're going to be used. And because of the urgency around AI, every company is going to need to make those APIs that it has AI ready. And we think Apollo can help with that. We think the technology is a good fit, the declarative architecture, the standards-based approach. And we're excited to go see what we can do to help companies get to a place where they're able to make the best use of that giant force, that giant disruption that's coming.
Cool. I love that. We've talked a lot about what technologies will sort of win and work over in this new grand AI centric world. What do you think just dies in 10 years? What technology do we look back at and say, I can't believe we wasted time on that?
Well, that's an interesting question. Gosh. Well, one interesting thing I've noticed is the models are trained on what's on the internet, and they have gotten really good at the things that are most popular. And there's been this interesting effect I've noticed where it's a virtuous cycle for those technologies. Like the models are really, really good at writing React code. And I think that has interesting implications for the stuff that isn't as popular in any given domain. Like there are other Vue frameworks, right? And they
Mm-hmm.
have their own advantages, but it just seems like AI drives a certain winner take all dynamic. And I suspect that that means certain frameworks, certain languages even may just find that um, they fall further and further behind on adoption. And again, it's vicious cycle, virtuous cycle, depending on what you're aiming for. But uh, I think that's an interesting consequence of the model companies focusing so much on the code authorship problem. And I've learned over my career, I'm a bit of a I've always gravitated to the oddball stuff in some ways. Uh, and I've learned the value of making safe and conservative choices. I've learned the value of you go with the open standard over the more, feature laden experimental idea. You go with the vendor that's got the stronger business model rather than the superior technology in some respect, because the vendor with the strong business model is the one that can make the greater investment. And therefore, over time, and we saw this play out in the database world with so many companies. I mentioned MongoDB before. I mean, there's an example. MongoDB was sort of known for a long time as like not the best database in some technical respects.
Especially of that
Like,
crop of databases, that it was really obvious that Mongo was the worst at that
and
point in
yet,
time.
and yet they had the strongest business because they understood the adoption journey. They understood how you sell into a developer. They understood what really mattered to a certain audience and how to grow that audience. And ultimately, that meant Mongo kept investing in the database, and now it's a really good database.
Yeah,
And if you picked one of the Mongo alternatives 15 years ago, you're the proud owner of a migration project now, right? Like, so
we've had several of them on this
I've
show.
learned that there's value in in attributes that aren't always the sort of which product is best. And I think AI seems to be another example of driving that and driving us toward a certain set of things that have rich training data and just are a better fit for the models in whatever way.
Yeah, that tracks. That absolutely tracks. Um, so many different thoughts, but yeah, we've had a couple of
I
people
don't know
on
what
this
that means
show
for the,
who,
I don't know, the F# community, but there you go.
sorry, friends. um, cool. And last question, which is really two questions. Where can people find you on the internet, and what would you like folks to get in touch with you about?
We're at apollo.dev, and we're interested in all things GraphQL and APIs. We're particularly interested in how can we help, what's hard about building agentic software, and how can we help? Where can some of the things that we've talked about today and that live inside the API tier be of some value? And the whole company's built on open source and taking pull requests, so it's the only way we've made forward progress, and I think the best way to do it. So we welcome the input and the help.
Awesome. Well, hopefully a couple more pull requests will show up in the in your projects as a result. But Matt, thank you
Yeah,
so much.
there's been a ton of interest in the MCP tools we've built so far. I've never seen anything like this. The energy level around MCP is bananas. I'm here in San Francisco. We have multiple meetups a week. It's just incredible, and there's something about MCP that harkens back to the early days of the web. It's sort of an open. There's almost like a mashup angle to it, right? Like I can make an MCP server for anything, and then I can use the model to glue that together in interesting new ways. And I think some combination of that and the excitement in the investment community, um, it just feels like the highest energy moment I've seen, and it's just a fun time to be doing this stuff.
It
So
really
yeah,
is.
the pull requests are the least of it. This is one special time to go learn a lot together and build some cool stuff together, and we're excited to be a part of that.
Absolutely. I've seen so much of what inspires me right now is like watching people use AI weird, because there is so much upside that is not already like crystallized into a company and the one way to do it. Like,
Yeah,
there's just people exploring stuff, people doing stuff and figuring stuff out. And it's a super exciting time to work around this pile of technologies.
yeah.
All right. Well, thank you so much, Matt. This is a great conversation.